To vote is to exist. One vote can rock the boat. Vote, it's what keeps us free. These are all slogans used to get Americans to go out and vote in recent years. But what if your vote didn't count? What if the process itself was not fair or prone to major inefficiencies? What if a candidate won more votes but ended up losing the election? Do these scenarios threaten the very foundations of American democracy? Well, let's go back to 2000, when Democratic presidential candidate Al Gore won more votes but lost the election to Republican candidate George W. Bush. But that's not all. One of the most significant political scandals in US history occurred in the state of Florida. The story unveils the fragility of the US electoral process. It paved way for a presidency that dragged the US into wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And 20 years later, the socio-political climate is much more polarized in the US. It's the eve of yet another critical presidential election, marred with accusations of possible electoral fraud, amplified by continuous statements by Trump over his skepticism of mail-in voting.
It's a fraud, and it's a shame.
And so, can the so-called land of the free and home of the brave afford another scandal? On November 7, 2000, former Vice President and Democratic candidate Al Gore had a lead of more than 500,000 votes in the national popular vote against his opponent, Texas Governor and Republican candidate George W. Bush. But who would win the Electoral College would all come down to Florida. The Florida Division of Elections announced on November 8 that Bush had won the state by 1,784 votes. However, this margin was so small that Florida law required a machine recount of the state that left Bush in the lead by just 327 votes. So you'd think, wow, that was close. I mean, just like in any sport contest, you have a close or tight duel, but whoever wins, wins, right? Well, no, it wasn't quite like that. The big issue was that on election day, a number of counties in Florida reported several problems. These included a so-called butterfly ballot in Palm Beach County. The butterfly ballot refers to the space that voters press to mark their choices being misaligned with the row of the given candidate, causing some to accidentally vote for the wrong candidate. In Palm Beach, that led to thousands of voters unwittingly casting their ballot to Pat Buchanan of the right-wing Reform Party. 22,000 votes in Duval County were also disqualified because voters chose more than one candidate. Moreover, there was a statewide inefficiency in the punch card apparatus, meaning that the machine would not record a ballot choice. All in all, 170,000 ballots could not be read by machine. Of these, 60,000 were undervotes, and the remaining 110,000 were overvotes. And so Bush's 327 vote lead was questionable. The Gore campaign requested a recount by hand in 4 heavily Democratic counties. The Bush campaign sued to stop this, and what followed was 36 days of turmoil and confusion where no one knew who would be the president of the United States. On December 8th, the Florida Supreme Court rejected Gore's request for a hand recount in 4 counties. Instead, it ordered a statewide hand recount of undervotes with the decisions being made according to the quote, intent of the voter. Then another dramatic U-turn occurred. The US Supreme Court halted the recount 4 days later, declaring that the voter intent standard violated the Equal Protections Clause of the 14th Amendment in the US Constitution. And so, under partisan lines, the US Supreme Court voted that the recount was unconstitutional and that no constitutionally valid recount would be made by December 12th. Many of Gore's detractors point out that he could have asked the Supreme Court to order a statewide recount with more explicit standards. But fearing a public uproar, he ceded defeat in a speech using rhetoric about the law and finding new bipartisan common ground. Bush officially won Florida by 537 votes and the Electoral College by 271 to 266. But just like Elvis Presley said, the truth is like the sun. You can shut it out for a time, but it ain't going away. A year later, in November 2001, the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago announced the results of the 170,000 undervotes and overvotes of the controversial election. The NORC concluded that with a statewide hand recount, Gore would have won Florida under every possible vote standard. A clear victory, gone with the wind. At the time, the news did not gain traction due to the overshadowing effect of the September 11 attacks. Even though media outlets such as CNN, the New York Times, and the Washington Post actually paid for the recount, when the results were published, no one was held accountable. On the contrary, just take a look at the New York Times headline from November 2001. It reads, quote, "Study of disputed Florida ballots finds justices did not cast a deciding vote." And even Al Gore was indifferent. When asked for a comment on the NORC study by the Washington Post, he responded, quote, "The 2000 election is over." Now this story is relevant to today because America may very well fall into another scandal or worse in the coming race. More than 211,000 Americans have died because of COVID-19. Protests over social injustice, police brutality, and racism have gained ground. Both far-right and far-left militant groups have brandished arms in the streets. Unemployment is 60% higher than it was when the last election took place. And so the socio-political fabric of the country is under threat, gradually turning the image of an American dream into an American nightmare. Not to mention that the last election was tainted by battles and hearings over foreign collusion. In the lead up to this presidential race, the integrity of the elections has already been put into question. In many states, the balloting system is antiquated. In others, registering to vote has deliberately been made harder, especially for the poor and people of color. Meanwhile, the COVID-19 pandemic has triggered a shift towards voting by mail, which Trump insists is unreliable, even though statistics show otherwise. Now, before I let you go, this whole story got me thinking a bit bigger. It's clear that the voting system in the US is broken and antiquated, to the point where it scarcely reflects the intentions of US citizens. The word democracy implies that there is a demos, or people, who go to choose or control their kratos, or government. So if the US can't get it right, then perhaps all those in Washington should abstain from lecturing, sanctioning, and warmongering other states under the banner of freedom and democracy.